In the sprawling, rain-kissed city of Seattle lived a young woman named Aria Voss. To the wealthy family she served and the marble halls she navigated daily, she was nearly invisible, just another maid in black and white, hands that folded linens and dusted surfaces no one watched her touch. She moved through the Bianchi mansion like a ghost maid of routine, her presence so thoroughly absorbed into the household that conversations continued as if she were furniture, as if her ears did not exist at all. Margaret Harrington, the family's social architect, spoke freely about foreclosures and business rivals while Aria scrubbed the Italian marble floors 3 feet away. The woman's voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the silence. "The Moretti contract is worthless now. I made certain of it." Aria's hands worked the baseboards, her eyes down, her breathing steady. She had learned long ago that invisibility was survival. You did not see. You did not hear. You did not exist. The studio apartment where she lived told a different story. Paper-thin walls carried the arguments of neighbors, a couple screaming about money, a child crying, a television bleeding tinny laughter into the darkness. Her lamp, a single 60-watt bulb in a ceramic stand she had found in a dumpster, cast a weak circle of light across her nightstand. On it lay an envelope. Inside were bills, mostly 1s and 5s, crumpled from her pocket. She counted them by that lamplight, the way she did every night. $78. Loose change in a mason jar brought the total to $81.43. The eviction notice sat on her counter, yellow and official. $125,000. The number seemed to exist in a different universe from her own. She had $78 to her name. The mathematics of her situation were simple and merciless. 30 days remained before her landlord locked her out. 30 days to find money that did not exist. But there were darker things than eviction. Douglas Hale had made certain of that. Her ex-boyfriend moved through Seattle like a poison spreading through water. He had shown up at the coffee shop where she worked 3 months earlier, called her names in front of customers, paid off the manager with $500 to make sure she never came back. At a grocery store, he had convinced the security guard that she was a thief. At another job, he had spread lies so convincing that her supervisor apologized before firing her. There was a restraining order, a thin piece of paper that meant nothing to a man with money and connections. The police sergeant he knew, Caldwell, always found reasons not to respond to her calls. She was trapped in a cage made of his hatred and her poverty, and every day the bars drew closer. The summer of that year arrived with suffocating heat. Aria worked extra shifts at the mansion, cleaning rooms that never seemed to need cleaning, folding towels that would be unfolded and folded again. But the money did not accumulate. It evaporated. Rent consumed it. Food cost more than it should. The bus pass for work. The single bottle of antibiotics she had needed after a cut on her hand became infected because she could not afford to see a doctor. By August, the $81 had dwindled to $43. Then $20. Then nothing. The night everything changed, a summer thunderstorm tore through Seattle with the violence of something alive. Lightning split the sky into bright and black. Rain fell in sheets that seemed to come sideways, driven by wind that bent the trees nearly horizontal. Aria had been walking home from the mansion, having worked a double shift. The bus she needed had stopped running. Walking was the only option. By the time the storm hit, she was 3 blocks away from any shelter, soaked through, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might crack. She pushed through the glass door of a late-night diner at 3 in the morning. The checkered floor, black and white squares worn smooth by 40 years of footsteps. Neon signs buzzed, Coca-Cola in red, diner in blue, open in green. The light was harsh and artificial and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. There was warmth here. There was shelter. The place was nearly empty. A single waitress, her face tired and kind, gestured Aria toward the restrooms. "Dry off, honey. There are paper towels." Aria moved like a broken thing, her movements stiff with cold, dripping water on the checkered floor. She dried herself as best she could, then returned to the main room and slid into a booth near the door, not wanting to track water across the diner. "Coffee?" the waitress asked. Aria hesitated. She had no money. She opened her mouth to say no, but the waitress was already pouring. "It's on the house. You look like you could use it." The coffee was hot and bitter and perfect. Aria wrapped her hands around the mug and let the steam rise into her face. Outside, the lightning continued to strobe across the night sky. She had nowhere to be. The mansion would be empty. Her apartment was barely shelter. For this moment, in this diner at 3 in the morning, she could simply exist without being invisible. A man sat in the back booth. She had not noticed him before, but now she saw him clearly. He was tall, muscular, dressed in a suit that cost more than everything she owned combined. His skin was olive-toned, his hair dark, his eyes the color of a storm-crossed sky. His presence made the empty diner feel crowded. He had the kind of stillness that suggested he was used to being obeyed. There was a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone, thin and white against his skin. On his wrist, a gold watch caught the neon light. Luca Bianchi did not look up from his espresso at first. But then something made him glance toward her, some shift in the air, some small disturbance that his mind registered. When he saw her face, his expression changed. Recognition flickered across his features like a flame catching in wind. He stood and moved toward her booth. His footsteps on the checkered floor were measured, unhurried. "You," he said quietly. His voice was deep and solid like an oath. "You are the one who pulled Emma from the street." Aria's hands trembled around her coffee mug. She had never seen this man before in her life, but she understood suddenly that he had seen her. That there was a reason he looked familiar, that her hands had pulled a small girl back from traffic, that the girl belonged to someone. "I do not know what you are talking about," she whispered. 2 weeks ago. Outside the museum. A car was coming. You pulled her back. My men saw it." His eyes studied her face like she was a map he needed to understand. "You are the maid. The one at the house." Aria. How did he know her name? She said nothing. "I have been looking for you," he continued. "To thank you. Emma, my daughter, she would be dead without you. And tonight, I find you like this." He gestured to her soaked clothes, her shaking hands. "Tell me. What is happening in your life?" Before she could answer, before she could form words, the waitress returned with more coffee. The moment stretched. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, 2 strangers sat across from each other, and neither of them understood that this moment, this single conversation in a diner at 3 in the morning, would rewrite everything that came after. Aria set down her mug. "I am nobody," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I do not matter. Because the people who did this to you believed you were nobody," Luca said quietly. "And that belief needs to be corrected." But what she did not comprehend, sitting in that diner booth with lightning splitting the sky outside and neon light reflecting in her wet hair, was that this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would expose Douglas Hale, would bring Margaret Harrington's cruelty into the light, and would transform a woman who had spent 18 months being invisible into someone unforgettable. The waitress refilled her coffee cup. Outside, the summer rain fell like 1,000 small blades against the diner windows. And in the back booth, Luca Bianchi watched this young woman with the careful attention of a man who had learned long ago that salvation often arrives wearing the face of someone the world had forgotten. Now let us go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the moment before the storm, before the diner, before she pulled a child from traffic. Back to the day Aria Voss first walked through the marble doors of the Bianchi mansion and began her descent into invisibility. Before we continue, if this story is resonating with you, drop a like right now. Share it with someone who needs to know that invisible people matter. Subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. Because what comes now will change everything. 2 weeks before the storm. 2 weeks before the diner. 2 weeks before everything shattered and reassembled into something neither of them could have predicted. The iron gates of the Bianchi mansion stood 16 feet high, wrought metal twisted into spirals that looked beautiful and impenetrable at the same time. Beyond them, a circular driveway wrapped around a fountain the size of a small house, water cascading over marble cherubs that had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Aria Voss stood outside those gates with her worn canvas bag and the prayer card in her apron pocket, her grandmother's, the only thing left from before, from when she had a name that meant something, and took a breath so shallow it barely filled her lungs. She had applied for the job 3 weeks earlier, desperate enough to ignore the voice in her head screaming that she did not belong here. The housekeeper position paid $400 a week. Cash. No questions. Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, had interviewed her in a kitchen the size of Aria's entire apartment, and the first thing she said was not welcome or we are so glad you applied. The first thing Mrs. Chen said was, you will not be seen. You will not be heard. You will move through this house like water moves through a cup, present but unnoticed. Do you understand? Aria nodded. The library dusting must be completed by 7 in the morning before the family wakes. Silver polishing before breakfast. The guest wing linens change on Tuesday and Friday. Master bedrooms on Thursday. You will use the staff entrance. You will eat in the kitchen after the family has finished. You will not speak unless spoken to, and you will not look anyone in the eye unless they initiate contact first. Do you understand? Aria nodded again. She understood perfectly. She had been invisible for so long that invisibility felt like the only shape she could still hold. The first day of work, Mrs. Chen walked her through the marble halls like a general surveying a conquered city. The entryway soared 3 stories high, a chandelier hanging from the ceiling that caught light and fractured it into 1,000 scattered stars. Aria's footsteps echoed on the polished floor. She could hear her own breathing. Mrs. Chen did not slow down, did not wait for questions, did not offer kindness or encouragement. She simply pointed and explained, and Aria followed. The library came first. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, rolling ladder on brass rails, a fireplace wide enough to stand in. Dust accumulated on every surface like a thin grey disease. Aria spent 40 minutes in silence, moving a feather duster across leather spines and mahogany railings. The smell of old paper and linseed oil hung heavy in the air. Her arms began to ache by hour 2. The silver came next. Drawer after drawer of forks and spoons and serving pieces, each one requiring separate cloths and specific polishing compounds. Mrs. Chen showed her the technique once, circular motions, not linear, always circular, and then left her alone with a cloth and a tin of paste that smelled like ammonia and old metal. The silver was beautiful. Completely unnecessary, but beautiful. Aria thought of the $7 in her checking account and polished harder. By evening, her hands were raw. Small red marks bloomed across her palms where the cloth had rubbed in the same spot for hours. She wrapped them in a towel from the staff bathroom and walked home through the Seattle drizzle, the kind of light rain that soaked through fabric without making a sound. Her studio apartment was a 15-minute bus ride away, located in a building that had been scheduled for demolition for 3 years and never quite made it to the bulldozers. 4 units on each floor. Thin walls. The couple next door screamed at each other every night at 9 o'clock, their voices traveling through the plaster like ghosts with unfinished arguments. The man above her played bass lines on a guitar that reverberated through her ceiling at 2 in the morning. There was no washer or dryer. There was no elevator. The radiator clanked and hissed like a dying animal when the heat came on. But it was hers. Technically. For now. Aria set her bag on the bed, a mattress on the floor that cost $99 at a liquidation store, and pulled out her phone. The screen had a spiderweb crack across the corner from when Douglas had thrown it against the wall 3 months ago. She opened her banking app with trembling fingers, the kind of trembling that had become so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. $78. Exactly. That was everything. She had paid rent for October, $350 to a landlord who barely maintained the building and certainly did not care that his tenant was slowly running out of ways to survive. The eviction notice was still taped to her wall above the bed, printed on official letterhead, filled with legal language that essentially meant she had until November 15th to produce $1,200 or disappear. The notice was dated 3 weeks ago. 15 days had already passed. Aria sat on the edge of her mattress and counted the money a second time, then a third time, then a fourth. 20s and 10s and 5s, each bill worn soft from handling. She had found $12 in coins at the bottom of her work bag. She had a half-gallon of milk in the shared refrigerator down the hall. An onion. Some rice. That would last 3 days if she was careful. If she did not eat breakfast. If she did not eat lunch. If she made the dinner portion small enough to disappear on a plate. The prayer card sat next to her on the mattress. Her grandmother's prayer card, laminated and worn at the edges, with a faded image of St. Jude, the patron of impossible causes, printed in blue and gold ink. On the back, someone had written in careful cursive, "When you are lost, remember that you are never truly alone." The handwriting had faded to barely visible after 30 years, but Aria could still read it. She had read it so many times the words had worn grooves into her memory. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It weighed almost nothing. At that same hour, 3 miles away in his office on the 42nd floor of the Riverside building, Luca Bianchi sat behind a desk made of dark walnut and listened to his daughter's nanny apologize for nearly allowing his 7-year-old to be killed by a delivery truck. Emma's nanny was a woman named Patricia, 43 years old, who had never made a mistake before this one. She stood in front of Luca's desk with her hands shaking and tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking apart with each word like a radio signal losing strength. I turned away for 1 second. She had her ball. There was a breeze and it rolled toward the street. I was holding her hand but she pulled away and I could not hold her. She was so fast. I would have been hit instead, but a woman, I do not know who she was, she ran and grabbed Emma and pulled her back. The truck missed them by maybe a foot. Luca had not moved during this entire confession. He sat perfectly still in his leather chair, the leather so supple and expensive it looked like skin. His fingers rested on the dark walnut in front of him, each movement deliberate and controlled. He was tall, 6'1", with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His hair was dark, silvered at the temples, and his eyes were the color of a storm before the rain arrives. There was a scar that ran from his left eye to his cheekbone, thin and pale, a permanent reminder of a fight he had won 30 years ago in a basement with bare knuckles and broken glass. When he finally spoke, his voice came out low and steady, like thunder heard from very far away. "The woman," he said. "Did you get her name?" "No." I was so frightened, and Emma was crying, and the nanny instinct was just to get her away from the street, away from the danger. When I looked up, the woman was already walking away. I do not even know what she looked like. Dark hair maybe. Thin. She was wearing a maid's uniform. Luca closed his eyes for a moment. The office was silent except for the sound of Seattle traffic 42 stories below, a distant hum like the city's heartbeat. When he opened his eyes again, there was something different in them. Something cold and precise, like a blade being sharpened. He picked up his phone and made a single call. "I need to find someone," he said. A pause. "A woman. Works as a maid. Dark hair. Pulled Emma back from a delivery truck in the park near the Riverside Commons this afternoon. Check the household services agencies. Check the mansion services. Find her. I want a name by morning." He hung up without waiting for confirmation. Tony and Sal would find her. They always found who he asked them to find. But in her small apartment with the radiator clanking like a broken metronome, Aria Voss did not know that her name had just entered the careful attention of the most dangerous man in Seattle. She did not know that in saving a small dark-haired child from traffic, she had unconsciously triggered a chain of events that would expose her to a power structure that operated by rules the ordinary world did not even know existed. She lay down on her mattress and pulled the single blanket over her shoulders. The prayer card rested against her ribs, where her heart beat out its small, frightened rhythm. Outside her window, the October rain fell like 1,000 small blades against the glass. 3 floors down, the couple next door began their nightly argument. And in the darkness of her studio apartment, Aria fell asleep counting not sheep but days, how many days until eviction, how many meals she could stretch from what she had, how many more nights she could survive on the very edge of nothing. Her phone sat on the nightstand, its cracked screen glowing with an unread text message from Douglas Hale. The message had arrived at 11:37 at night. It read, "I know where you work now." The words glowed in the darkness. She had not read them yet. Tomorrow morning, when she found them, they would make her hands shake while she polished the Bianchi family silver. But tonight, she slept the thin sleep of someone whose fear had become so constant it felt like breathing. Like a necessary function of survival. Like the price of staying alive. The summer rain fell like 1,000 small blades against the checkered floor of Dolores's diner, each drop visible through the windows that fogged with the heat of frying bacon and brewing coffee. The clock above the counter read 2:47 in the morning. Outside, the sky split open again, lightning cracking white and violent across downtown Seattle, thunder following so close it made the neon open sign flicker and buzz. Aria Voss pushed through the door dripping, her thin black jacket plastered to her shoulders, rain streaming from her hair into her eyes. Her shoes squelched against the black and white tiles. She stood just inside the entrance, shaking, trying to gather herself, her whole body trembling from the cold that had soaked through to bone. Dolores looked up from behind the counter, reading glasses perched on a chain around her neck. She was in her 60s, with the weathered kindness of someone who had worked night shifts for 40 years and understood what it meant to have nowhere else to go. "Honey, you look like a drowned cat," Dolores said. "Sit anywhere. I'll get you something warm." Aria nodded wordlessly and slid into a booth near the door, still shaking, her fingers fumbling with the wet fabric of her jacket. She could not afford coffee. She could not afford anything in this place. But she could sit here, where it was warm, where she was not alone. She did not see Luca Bianchi at first. He sat in the back corner booth, barely visible in the shadows beyond the reach of the neon glow. A cup of untouched coffee sat in front of him, grown cold hours ago. His dark suit was still perfectly tailored, but his tie hung loosened around his neck, and there was something exhausted in the set of his shoulders, something his men had never seen in 15 years of service. He had been sitting in this diner since midnight, waiting for news about Emma, replaying the moment she had been pulled back from traffic by a woman whose name he did not know. His men had found her 2 days ago, Aria Voss, employed as a maid at the Bianchi mansion for 18 months. 27 years old. No criminal record. No family listed. Living in a studio apartment 3 floors above a couple who screamed at each other every night through paper-thin walls. $78 in her checking account. A restraining order against an ex-boyfriend that meant nothing because Sergeant Caldwell was a corrupt man who preferred cash to justice. Luca had spent 2 days not knowing what to do with this information. He was not accustomed to owing debts he could not repay with money or threat. And then, at 2:32 in the morning, the rain had started, and he had found himself driving to this diner, the one place where no one knew him, where he could sit and think without his men watching. He was watching the rain when Aria walked in. Recognition moved through him like lightning. The girl from the park. The one who had saved Emma. Soaking wet, shaking, the picture of someone who had no one and nothing and nowhere to be except here, in this empty diner, in the middle of the night, because the storm had given her no choice. Luca stood slowly and walked to her booth. His shoes made no sound against the checkered floor. "Aria Voss," he said. She looked up, startled, fear flashing across her face. Water dripped from her hair. Her eyes were dark and wary, the eyes of someone who had learned not to trust men who approached her. "How do you know my name?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling like a candle in wind. "You saved my daughter," Luca said. 2 weeks ago. The little girl in the park. Emma. You pulled her back from traffic." Aria's face went pale. Her hand gripped the edge of the table. "I didn't realize. I just reacted. I didn't know whose child." Luca sat down across from her without asking permission. The booth creaked under his weight. Up close, he could see the bruises fading on her wrists, the calluses on her hands from cleaning other people's homes, the tremor that ran through her entire body. Thank you, he said quietly. You gave her back to me when you had no reason to. Something in his face, something broken beneath the dangerous exterior, made Aria's eyes fill with tears she refused to let fall. Dolores appeared with a menu, took one look at Luca, and her entire demeanor shifted. She did not know who he was, not exactly, but she knew the type, the kind of man who took up space just by existing in it. Whatever she wants, Luca told her. Coffee. Food. Whatever she wants. Aria started to protest. I can't pay for. It's handled, Luca said. When the food arrived, scrambled eggs still steaming, toast with butter, hash browns golden and crisp, Aria ate like someone who had forgotten what fullness felt like. She tried to maintain dignity, keeping her bite small and measured, but hunger won. It always did. Luca watched her with the recognition of someone who remembered what it felt like to be desperate. How long since you ate? He asked. Yesterday morning. The answer hung between them. Yesterday morning. She had worked 16 hours at the mansion, walked home in darkness, and had not eaten. Today she would do it again. How long have you worked at my house? Luca asked. 18 months. And I never saw you. Aria's hand moved to her pocket, where the worn prayer card rested against her ribs. No one does. That's the point. They talked through the night, or Luca talked while Aria listened and occasionally answered. He told her about his childhood in the industrial district, about a father who came home drunk and violent, a mother who died when he was 9, about living in a studio apartment so small it made hers look spacious. He told her about stealing food to survive, about swearing that no child under his watch would suffer as he had. Aria listened to every word, and with each sentence, she felt something shift inside her, the careful walls she had built around herself beginning to crack. The rain outside gentled to a drizzle. The clock moved from 3 to 4 to 5. Dolores refilled their coffee cups without comment. At 6 in the morning, the sun was beginning to paint the horizon gray, and Luca stood. I'll have someone pick you up, he said. Every morning after your shift. You won't wait in the rain again. Aria did not argue this time. 3 days later, Aria was alone in the library, polishing silver that cost more than everything she owned. Her hands moved on automatic, muscle memory carrying her through the task while her mind wandered to the conversation at the diner, to the way Luca had listened, to the way he had looked at her like she was something other than invisible. The library door opened. Tony and Sal entered, not noticing her position behind the heavy curtains. Boss has been different since that night, Tony said. His voice carried the weight of observation of a man who noticed what changed in the man he served. Sal made a sound of agreement. Asked me about the staff yesterday. When's the last time he cared about housekeepers? Tony lowered his voice further. It's the girl. The one who saved Emma. He's been asking questions. Tony found her file. She's drowning, man. 22,000 in foreclosure, living like a ghost, got some ex-boyfriend stalking her that Caldwell's protecting because the family's paying him. What's the boss going to do? I don't know. But I've worked for him 15 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at her. It scared me, Sal. And I don't scare easy. They left. Aria remained frozen behind the curtain, the dust cloth hanging from her hand, her heart beating so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The next morning, Luca found her in the kitchen alone, preparing Mrs. Bianchi's breakfast, eggs, toast, fresh fruit arranged on a white plate with the kind of care she gave to everything. Walk with me, he said. It was not a question, and Aria understood enough about power dynamics to know that questions and commands sounded the same in his voice. She followed him through the mansion to the garden, where summer roses opened in shades of pink and crimson, where a stone fountain whispered softly to itself. The garden was empty. No staff. No witnesses. I had someone look into your situation, Luca said, and Aria's stomach clenched because she knew what was coming. Douglas Hale. The restraining order that's worth less than the paper it's printed on because Sergeant Caldwell is on his family's payroll. Aria's face went white. You had no right. You pulled my daughter from traffic and asked for nothing. That gave me the right." He paused, his dark eyes steady on her face. "The foreclosure notice. $22,000. The $78 you count every night when you think no one is watching." Aria stepped backward, humiliation burning through her. "How do you?" "Because I make it my business to know when someone I owe a debt to is drowning," Luca said. He stepped closer, and Aria backed away until her shoulders touched the stone wall of the mansion. "I have arranged payment for the foreclosure. The apartment is yours, free and clear." Aria's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for months, maybe years. "Why would you help me?" Her voice broke. "I am nobody." Luca stepped closer still, until she could see the exact shade of his eyes, until she could hear the subtle rasp of his breath. "You are the woman who saved my daughter," he said quietly, and each word landed like a weight. "That makes you somebody." From the house window, Tony and Sal watched in stunned silence. "In 15 years, Sal whispered, I have never seen him like this." But across the city, in a lawyer's office on the 42nd floor of a glass building that reflected the Seattle skyline, Margaret Harrington sat across from her hired investigator, James Chen, studying the photographs spread across mahogany. Margaret was in her early 50s, beautiful in the way that cold women are beautiful, symmetrical, expensive, sharp. Her suit cost $3,000. Her watch cost more. Her ex-husband cost her more than either of them. "Tell me about this woman," she said, pointing to a photograph of Aria standing in the garden with Luca. James Chen cleared his throat. "Aria Voss. 27. Employed at the Bianchi mansion for 18 months. No criminal record, no family listed, previously working as a waitress and hotel housekeeper. Financial records show recent significant debt resolution." Margaret's eyes narrowed. Luca, paying off a young woman's debt. Luca, who had given Margaret nothing when they divorced, who had fought her for custody of Emma with the kind of relentless focus he usually reserved for his empire. "Find out everything about her," Margaret said. "Bank records, employment history, family, friends, secrets. I want to know what hold she has on my ex-husband." When James left, Margaret sat alone in her office, looking out at the city spread beneath her like a kingdom she had not learned to rule. She had lost Emma. She had lost Luca. She would not lose the satisfaction of taking something from him. At that same hour, in a parking garage beneath a shuttered warehouse on the south side, Douglas Hale leaned against a rusted sedan, smoking a cigarette that tasted like regret and rage. He had been watching Aria for weeks, trying to get close to her, trying to remind her that she belonged to him, that she would always belong to him. But something had changed. Someone had changed everything. A black Mercedes pulled into the space next to his. The window rolled down. A woman's face appeared, cold and calculating. "You're the ex-boyfriend," Margaret Harrington said. It was not a question. Douglas recognized Predator when he saw it. He threw his cigarette aside and leaned toward the window. "You're the ex-wife." "It seems," Margaret said slowly, "that we both have a problem with the same girl." Douglas smiled, ugly and knowing. "Then maybe we should solve it together." The rain started again outside the parking garage, drumming on the concrete like the beating of a warning heart. But inside the Mercedes, Margaret and Douglas were already speaking, already planning, already deciding how to destroy the girl who had managed to make two powerful people care about her survival. Neither of them knew that Luca Bianchi had security on half the city. Neither of them knew that the moment they shook hands in that garage, they had triggered an avalanche that would bury them both. But they would learn. They would learn very soon. The rain hammered against the windows of the warehouse like an accusation that could not be ignored. Aria sat in a metal chair in the center of an empty space, surrounded by darkness so complete it felt like drowning in ink. Her lip was split, swollen, tasting of blood and copper. Her left arm throbbed where Douglas had grabbed her, fingers already bruising purple. She was shaking, not from cold, but from the understanding that had finally arrived. She had made a terrible mistake thinking she could hide from what she had set in motion. Footsteps echoed across concrete. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black cashmere coat worth more than a year of her old rent. Luca Bianchi. His dark eyes caught the single overhead light and reflected nothing. Behind him, Tony and Sal flanked the doorway like bookends made of muscle and menace. "Where is she?" Aria's voice came out barely a whisper, fractured like old glass. Luca did not sit. He stood above her, looking down at the split lip, the bruises forming on her neck, the terror etched into every line of her body. "Emma is safe. She is sleeping in my home with 3 security teams and Marco reading her bedtime stories. She is exactly where she needs to be. Douglas is no longer your concern." The words fell into the space between them like stones into a well. Aria's hands trembled on her lap. She had been running for weeks, first from Douglas, then from the understanding that she had dragged Luca and Emma into the crosshairs of 2 people who had decided her existence was negotiable. Margaret had taken Emma. Douglas had left her bleeding. And Luca had simply disappeared. For 36 hours, nothing. No calls. No reassurance. Just silence so heavy it crushed her lungs. "What are you going to do?" Aria asked. Luca turned away from her, his silhouette sharp against the distant city lights visible through the warehouse's high windows. When he spoke, his voice was deep and solid like an oath carved into stone. "I made you a promise the night I found you drowning in that diner. I told you that you would never be invisible again. That you would never be a target. That anyone who laid a hand on you would answer to me." He turned back to face her. "Douglas Hale laid his hands on you." "He's gone," Aria said, understanding flickering like a terrible light. "You sent him away. I sent him somewhere he will spend every remaining day understanding what it means to be powerless. To be small. To be the kind of prey he hunted." Luca stepped closer. "The Kozlov family has been looking for leverage against their Seattle operations. I gave them a gift. Douglas will work in their organization until the day he dies, and he will never leave." Aria closed her eyes. Death would have been mercy. This was something far more precise. This was systematic erasure, not of his life, but of everything he had been. His freedom. His choice. His hope. "Margaret," Aria began, "is no longer a threat to anyone." The words arrived like a blade wrapped in ice. Tony shifted his weight, and Aria caught his eye for just a moment. In that fraction of a second, she saw something she had never seen before: shock. In 15 years of working for Luca Bianchi, Tony had witnessed violence and calculation and cold mercy. But he had never witnessed mercy that was gentle. That was this. "How?" Aria asked. Luca moved to the chair beside her and sat down for the first time. When he did, it was as if the entire warehouse exhaled. Doctored evidence can be undoctored. Bribed social workers can be exposed. Judges with affairs leave paper trails. Margaret was not careful because she believed herself untouchable. She was wrong. He reached into his coat and produced a phone. On the screen, a news report played silently: Margaret Harrington, her face twisted in rage, being led away from a charity gala in handcuffs. Cameras flashed. Guests gasped. The headline burned white letters against black: prominent Seattle socialite arrested on federal bribery and fraud charges. 40 years minimum, Luca said quietly. Federal charges. Every asset frozen. Every friend abandoning her. Her name became a synonym for corruption in 48 hours. She will never hold custody of Emma again. She will never hold anything again. Aria stared at the frozen image of Margaret's face contorting from confident smile to animal fury in 3 seconds. She had wanted Margaret stopped. She had wanted to protect Emma. But this systematic dismantling, this total annihilation, it was so complete it frightened her. And Caldwell, she asked, was arrested by Internal Affairs 2 hours before Douglas disappeared. Federal charges. He is cooperating with prosecutors to avoid 20 years in prison. He is telling them everything, every bribe, every threat, every time he ignored your calls for help. The words landed like relief and terror braided together. Everything that had held Douglas up was gone. Everything that had protected Margaret had crumbled. The entire architecture of cruelty that had been constructed around her life had been dismantled in 2 days by a man who barely raised his voice. "Why?" Aria whispered. Luca turned to face her fully. The scar running from his eye to his cheekbone caught the light, making him look like something carved from stone. "You know why." "I don't. I'm nobody. I was always nobody. I serve dinner and dust furniture and people see through me like I am made of air. You are no longer that person. And you never will be again." He reached into his coat and withdrew something small. A worn prayer card, faded at the edges, the image of a saint barely visible after years of handling. Aria's breath caught. It was hers, the one she kept in the pocket of her uniform, the one that had belonged to her grandmother. "You dropped this in the mansion the night Douglas hurt you." "I found it on the steps." Luca placed it gently in her palm. "Whatever saint your grandmother prayed to, she was listening." Aria closed her fingers around the card and something inside her that had been locked for so long cracked open. Tears spilled down her face, mixing with the taste of blood still lingering on her split lip. This man, this dangerous man with men in suits and empires built on dark foundations, had kept her prayer card. Had found it. Had returned it like a benediction. "Emma wants to see you," Luca said, standing. "She has not stopped asking since Margaret was taken from the gala." She drew another picture. She labeled it, "Aria comes home." He did not say home. He said it like it was already decided. Like she had already agreed. Like he knew something she was still learning about herself, that she was capable of accepting the kind of love that protected. The kind that moved mountains and dismantled empires for a girl who had once simply pulled a small child back from traffic. Tony opened the warehouse door. Beyond it, the rain had stopped. The sky was clearing from the west, and where the clouds broke open, light was pouring through, the kind of light that arrives after the storm, when everything has been washed clean. "Come," Luca said, extending his hand. Aria took it. His grip was warm and steady, and when he pulled her to her feet, she realized she was no longer shaking. The rain-soaked streets of Seattle spread out before them, and somewhere in the city, in a mansion made of marble and history, a small girl was waiting. A girl who had drawn a picture with 3 stick figures holding hands. A girl who was no longer alone. A girl whose father had just rewritten the entire world to make room for this frightened woman to step into it. The drive across Seattle took 17 minutes. Traffic lights turned green as they approached. City lights blurred past the Mercedes windows like falling stars. At the mansion, security teams stepped aside as Luca walked through with Aria's hand still in his. The marble halls that had been empty and cold when she dusted them now felt full of possibility. And at the top of the stairs, in pink pajamas with her dark hair tangled from sleep, Emma stood waiting. "Aria!" She ran without hesitation, without fear, and when Aria knelt down to catch her, the small girl wrapped her arms around Aria's neck with the trust of someone who had already been promised she would never be abandoned again. Over Emma's shoulder, Luca watched. And in that moment, the most dangerous man in Seattle was simply a father watching his daughter hold the person who mattered. The prayer card was still in Aria's other hand. Her grandmother had been listening. And after 48 hours of systematic justice, after the complete dismantling of everything that threatened her, Aria Voss finally understood she was no longer nobody. She was home. 1 year later, the penthouse office on the 32nd floor of the Pearl District Tower caught the September light like a prism, all glass and steel and possibility. Aria Voss sat at a desk of pale oak, reviewing case files with the focus of someone who had learned that details save lives. 3 women moved through the open floor beyond her glass walls, all of them survivors, all of them hired because they understood what it meant to claw back from nothing. The non-profit that bore no name but carried Aria's vision had expanded to 3 cities in 12 months. A donation of $2 million had made it possible, anonymous, untraceable, though Aria had known the moment she saw the wire transfer originate from a shell corporation registered in Luxembourg. Luca's fingerprints were nowhere on it, but she felt them anyway, like a hand pressed against her back, pushing her forward. Her assistant, a woman named Claire who had fled her husband with nothing but a suitcase and a bruised cheekbone, knocked softly on the glass door. "Ms. Voss," the Seattle Times called again. "They want to do a profile on the expansion into Portland." Aria looked up from the file in front of her. Inside it was a photograph of a woman named Rosa, age 26, sitting with her 2 children in a temporary housing unit that Aria's program had secured for her. Rosa's smile was tentative, fragile, but it was there. "Tell them yes," Aria said. "Tell them we can do the interview on Thursday." Claire nodded and disappeared. Aria stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that made up the eastern wall of her office. Seattle spread out below her like a promise kept, the Space Needle, the sound glinting silver, the mountains beyond holding their breath in the distance. She thought about the diner, about the neon sign that still hummed its tired song at 2 in the morning, about the night a man with storm-gray eyes had looked at her like she was not invisible. The prayer card sat in a frame on her desk now, positioned beside a photograph taken 6 months ago at Volunteer Park. In it, Luca stood with his hand on Emma's shoulder, his expression something close to peace. Aria stood beside them both, her head tilted slightly toward Emma's, all 3 of them caught mid-laugh at something Luca had said. She looked at that photograph every morning before she opened the files of women still waiting for rescue. It reminded her that transformation was possible. That love did not always arrive wrapped in danger. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a small girl who had learned to trust again, and a man who had learned that empires meant nothing if the people you loved were standing outside the walls. The elevator chimed. Aria's body went still, though she did not understand why. Security would have announced a visitor. The elevator doors slid open, and Luca Bianchi stepped out into her office wearing a dark charcoal suit and the weight of a year of missing someone. He had not changed. Somehow he had not changed at all, though his face carried a softness it had not possessed before, as if her absence had carved something gentle into the spaces where hardness used to live. "How did you find me?" Aria asked. The question was not really a question. She had left no forwarding address, no email, no way to trace her beyond the charity paperwork, which had been filed by lawyers who asked no questions. "I never stopped looking," Luca said. His voice was exactly as she remembered, deep and solid like an oath, like something sworn in blood and kept through centuries. They stood on opposite sides of the office, 5 feet of air between them thick with 12 months of silence. Aria had needed that silence. She had needed to stand on her own 2 feet, to prove to herself that she could build something without his name, his money, his protection wrapping around her like chains. She had needed to know that the woman who emerged was not his creation but her own. "You left without saying goodbye," Luca said. "I needed to know I could stand without you holding me up." "And can you?" "Yes." Aria moved toward the window. Luca followed, and they stood side by side looking out at the city. The afternoon light was turning golden at the edges, that particular quality of Seattle light that only arrived when summer was releasing its hold. "The donation that started this place. That was you. You saved Emma," Luca said. "This does not even approach repayment. It's not a debt." Aria turned to face him. "Is it?" Luca was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times and was still afraid of getting them wrong. "I have carried something for a year. Something I could not say when you were vulnerable, when you needed protection. It would have been unfair. Predatory, even. A man in my position, with my resources, taking advantage of a woman with nothing." He turned to look at her directly. "But you are no longer that woman. You are successful. Independent. Safe on your own terms. So you came to say something now." "I came to tell you the truth." Luca stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of him, expensive cologne beneath something warmer, something that was just him. That night in the diner, when I recognized the woman who had pulled my daughter back from traffic, when I saw you sitting there soaked and trembling, something shifted. I have taken territory and crushed enemies and accumulated more money than any person could spend in 10 lifetimes. But none of it has ever made me feel what I felt watching you exist in this world. Every day since that night, I have thought about you. About the way your voice sounded when you read to Emma. About your hands counting $78 like it was the most precious thing in existence. About your courage when Douglas tried to break you and you refused to shatter. Aria's eyes were filling with tears, and she did not know how to stop them. I am not the same man I was, Luca continued. Watching you fight to stand reminded me why I clawed out of poverty in the first place. Not for power. Not for territory or money or respect. For dignity. For the right to choose. For the ability to protect the people I love. He reached out and took her hand. You taught me that again. I'm not the same girl you met in that diner, Aria whispered. Neither am I the same man. And that is exactly as it should be. Luca's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. What I am asking is this: if you will have me, and not as the man who saved you, but as a man who is better because you existed in his world, I would like to try. No protection unless you ask for it. No debt. No transaction. Just two people choosing each other. Aria stepped closer. She could see the scars now, the thin white line that ran from his temple to his cheekbone, the evidence of violence survived and transcended. Emma asks about you in every email, she said. She asks about you every single day. When she comes home from school, before she even takes off her backpack, she asks if Aria has called. Luca's voice cracked slightly. I have no right to ask this of you. I know that. But I am asking anyway. Aria closed the distance between them. Their foreheads touched. I'm scared, she breathed. So am I. She kissed him, and the kiss was nothing like the desperate, grateful kiss on the balcony a year ago. This kiss was equal. It was a choice made by a woman who stood on her own ground, and a man willing to stand beside her without needing to hold her up. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying, the kind of tears that come from a wound finally allowed to heal. 6 months later, breakfast happened at a kitchen table in Luca's house, in the room where he had once eaten alone, where his men had once stood at attention waiting for orders. Now Emma sat between them in her school uniform, her dark hair braided by Aria's careful hands, sticky syrup on her fingers as she chatted about her teacher and her best friend Maya and the science project where she had grown seeds in a clear jar so you could see the roots becoming roots, reaching downward toward something they could not see but believed in anyway. Tony and Sal watched from the doorway, exchanging the kind of glance that passed between men who had worked together long enough to need no words. Sal whispered, "Never thought I'd see the day." Tony nodded. Best thing that ever happened to him. The non-profit expanded into Portland and then into San Francisco. Aria stood at a podium in a renovated community center, addressing a crowd of survivors and donors and people whose lives had been remade by the possibility of a second beginning. Behind her, projected on a screen, photographs, women at job interviews, children in new schools, families in homes where the locks had been changed and the terror had been left behind in rooms that no longer belonged to them. I know what it is to be invisible, Aria said, her voice steady and clear as a bell. I know what it is to count your last dollars and wonder if you will make it to morning. To believe that the world has already decided your value and found you wanting. But I also know what it is to be seen. To have someone choose to stay when the storm arrives. To be given a second chance not because you earned it through suffering, but because someone believed you deserved it anyway. That is what we do here. We see you. And we stay. From the audience, Luca watched with Emma on his knee. The little girl was asleep against his shoulder, her mouth slightly open, completely at peace in the way that only children could be when they knew they were safe. His hand rested on Aria's knee, and when she looked out into the crowd and found him, her entire expression softened into something that looked like home. The diner still existed, still hummed its tired song at 2 in the morning. Aria and Luca pushed open the glass door on a Thursday night in October when the Seattle rain had turned gentle, when the violence of the summer storm had been absorbed back into the earth and replaced by the kind of rain that washed things clean without destroying them. Dolores, the waitress who had served them that first night, looked up from her register and broke into a smile. "Well, look who it is. The drowned cat and her brooding gentleman. You two finally figure it out." Aria laughed. "Something like that." They sat in the same booth where everything had begun, where a terrified girl had sheltered from a storm and a powerful man had recognized something broken in her that mirrored something broken in himself. Dolores brought coffee without being asked, moving through her shift with the ease of someone who had served 1,000 cups in 1,000 moments, most of them forgotten, but this one she would remember. Outside, the rain continued its gentle work. Inside, Luca reached across the table and took Aria's hand. Emma was with his mother tonight, safe and cared for and utterly certain of her place in the world. He did not have to be anywhere else. There were no emergencies, no threats, no wars being fought in the spaces between boardrooms and back alleys. There was only this, coffee growing cold, a woman he loved looking at him like he had given her everything when the truth was she had given him back the thing he had lost years ago, the ability to believe that life could hold something gentle. 3 months later, on a day when the Seattle sky was clear and blue in a way that felt like a promise being kept, Aria, Luca, and Emma walked through Volunteer Park. Emma ran ahead in that fearless way of children who had never been taught to be afraid, her dark hair flying behind her like a flag. Luca's arm wrapped around Aria's shoulders, and she leaned into him, no longer needing to prove anything to anyone. They were not hiding. They were not running. They were not invisible. They were simply, finally, home. "I spent 18 months believing I was nobody," Aria thought as she watched Emma chase a pigeon across the grass. "I counted my last dollars and wondered if I deserved even that much." But sometimes survival is not about being seen by everyone. It is about being seen by the right person at the right moment. It is about someone choosing to stay when the storm arrives, and choosing to love you not because you have earned it through suffering, but because you exist. If this story touched your heart, please drop a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's coming next. We will see you in the next one. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.